Hello everyone, my name is Emma, and this is Learn from the Past, a channel where I geek out about cool history stuff and you hopefully learn some cool history stuff. Let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about Deaf President Now, the week-long protest at Gallaudet University, sometimes referred to as the Deaf Civil Rights Movement. Let's get started. Gallaudet University was founded at the close of the American Civil War in 1864, and in the first 124 years after its founding, between 1864 and 1987, 6 people served as Gallaudet University's president, all of whom were men, and all of whom were hearing. Why? Deaf civil rights were, and are, an ongoing struggle in the United States, and there were other issues that the community focused on in that century and a quarter. By 1987, however, the deaf community had made huge strides. In 1960, American Sign Language was recognized as a language. And in the 1960s and 70s, the first deaf people in the country began earning doctorate degrees. So when then university president, Dr. Edward C. Merrill, announced his impending retirement that year, the deaf community decided it was time that a deaf person become president of Gallaudet University. The Gallaudet University Board of Trustees Presidential Search Committee, or PSC, was in charge of compiling a list of qualified candidates. When deaf board member Philip W. Brovin was chosen to chair the search committee, the Gallaudet community and the American deaf community at large began to hope that now was finally the time for a deaf president. In his memoir on Deaf President Now, Controlling Our Destiny, Brovin writes that he knew that accepting the role as search committee chair meant that he would do all in his power to steer the search committee toward a deaf candidate. Students, faculty, and staff began demonstrating immediately, sending emails and letters to the PSC recommending a deaf president. Outgoing president Dr. Merrill even recommended that the board choose a deaf president as his replacement. Marches and class sit-ins were arranged. Overall, there was an atmosphere of hope. So when the PSC announced via a bulletin that the board had voted 10-4 along hearing deaf lines to install hearing candidate Dr. Elizabeth Zinser as the next president, all hell broke loose. Student protesters walked off campus to the Mayflower Hotel to meet with the Board of Trustees. The board was attempting to announce Dr. Zinser via press conference, but ended up fielding questions from angry protesters as well. It was Sunday, March 6, 1988. Hearing board chair Jane Spillman, as well as Dr. Zinser, tried to talk to the crowd. Their use of interpreters, since neither woman knew American Sign Language, was indicative of their outsider status and only further incensed the crowd. Spillman only answered questions from hearing people because it was easier for her. This did not go unnoticed by the protesters. At some point in this press conference, Spillman was reported to have said, quote, "Deaf people cannot function in a hearing world," end quote. The room was noisy and small. The interpreters admitted to having a hard time hearing, and Spillman denies that she ever said this. However, her words had been interpreted that way, and it was too late. And as the protesters later pointed out, the miscommunication would never have happened if Spillman had ever learned how to sign. When Spillman made this alleged statement, the crowd had had enough. Not letting Spillman or Zinser speak further, they simply left. That night, as the students left the Mayflower Hotel, students Greg Leibach, Jerry Covell, Brigetta Bourne, and Tim Raris led the protesters to the U.S. Capitol, where the group was told of Spillman's comments and the board's decision. These 4 would become the student leaders of the protest that followed. Around dawn on Monday, March 7th, students drove vans and cars in front of the only 5 gated entrances to Gallaudet University, blocking anyone off campus from entering. The Deaf President Now movement had officially begun. The organized protest under the 4 student leaders made a list of 4 demands that became a rallying cry of the movement. Number 1, Elizabeth Zinser resigns and is replaced by a deaf candidate. Number 2, Jane Spillman resigns. Number 3, the Board of Trustees has a 51% deaf majority. And number 4, no reprisals for anyone participating in the protest. The Board of Trustees agreed to meet with the students on the second day, but they showed up 2 hours late with a lawyer who explained via interpreter that Elizabeth Zinser was the final pick for president. Nothing had changed. The students left again. Student protesters, as well as adult community leaders, began contacting every deaf person they knew, as well as news stations. Deaf people from all over the country, including hearing interpreters, showed up over the next week to lend whatever support they could to the movement. By Tuesday night, DPN was national news. Many of these articles include interviews from local deaf people, not just in the DC or Gallaudet area. This protest was introducing the idea of deaf community to the hearing world. On Wednesday, March 9th, as Zinser and her team attempted to get into the locked campus, the students spoke to the press through interpreters, garnering national attention and support. Zinser finally made it through the student blockade and tried to placate the angry protesters, but it was no use. Jane Spillman, following Zinser on campus, pointed out that many hearing faculty members had learned to sign after being hired. This, however, was patently false, as knowing ASL was a prerequisite for faculty onboarding, something the students were well aware of. By late Wednesday afternoon, the protest was extremely organized. Committees had been set up to make sure that the press had access to deaf people who wanted to talk to them, committees to write press briefs, and many more. Many of the faculty, who had nothing else to do, brought food to the protesters and volunteered their services in other ways. Early Wednesday evening, the faculty withdrew its support of Zinser and called for her to resign. It was a huge blow. Most of the reason Zinser had been selected in the first place was because of the majority support of the faculty. On Wednesday evening, student leader Greg Leibach, deaf actress Marlee Matlin, and Elizabeth Zinser appeared together in a joint television interview. The program ended with Zinser saying that she hopes someday a deaf person would be president of Gallaudet, and Leibach and Matlin saying that the deaf community had been hearing someday for over a century and were tired of it. That night, March 10th, school buses were driven in front of all of the entrances to campus, and the tires deflated. A variety of rallies were held on March 11th, where supporters chanted rallying cries and outside organizations pledged their support. On the steps of Chapel Hill, Mo Biller, the president of the American Postal Workers Union, presented the students with a $5,000 check for the DPN fund. Biller used his limited American Sign Language skills to sign "Deaf President Now," to the thrill of the observers. At the rally, I. King Jordan threw his support behind the protest. Jordan said that he changed his mind when, a few days in, he realized that the issue had become a civil rights issue, and that the issue of a deaf president was of paramount importance to the deaf community. Late Thursday evening, Zinser met with her staff and supporters and listened to what was going on campus. When she heard the words civil rights used in reference to the protest, she knew it was lost. Zinser turned to Spillman and said simply, "Jane, I resign." Greg Leibach sent Zinser a letter the following day thanking her for resigning and noting that she was a victim of circumstance, walking unprepared into a powder keg. Following Zinser's resignation, support began to flood in from all over the country for the other 3 demands. U.S. representatives and senators, as well as all the U.S. presidential candidates that year, sent in letters of support for the student protest. On Friday, there was a massive march from Gallaudet to the U.S. Capitol building. The police blocked off the march route and protected marchers because DPN had secured a parade permit beforehand. Some marchers borrowed a banner from the Crispus Attucks Museum in D.C. that said, "We still have a dream." This was another way that marchers demonstrated that the issue was one of civil rights. At the march on Friday, the student leaders Laibach, Born, Raris, and Covell reminded the crowd that though DEF President Now secured the resignation of Zinsser, there were still 3 demands to go. A few days later, Jane Spilman resigned. She felt hurt and discouraged that the deaf community that she loved so much saw her as an outsider, but she knew that it was time to step down. She was replaced by deaf board member Philip W. Bravin. 2 of the 4 demands had been met. Zinsser and Spilman had resigned. They were halfway there. On the evening of Friday, March 11th, the Board of Trustees met again to discuss how to address the protest. On Saturday, March 12th, the Board of Trustees was still trying to come to a conclusion about what to do. Letters from all over the country in support of the protest poured in. The board spent much of the day reading them over. Approximately half of the letters received were addressed directly to Jane Spilman. The board was getting close to making a decision. The next evening, Sunday, March 13th, over TTD, a desktop typing machine used for deaf communication, Phil Bravin told student leader Greg Laibach that all 4 demands had been met. Not only had Zinsser and Spilman resigned, but deaf candidate Dr. Irving King Jordan had been chosen as Gallaudet's next president, and the board had agreed to no reprisals against any students, faculty, or staff who participated in the protest. In return, Bravin asked Laibach to open the campus. Laibach agreed. Dr. Jordan gave his acceptance speech live on television. His wife held his script for him so that he could sign it. It was the first time a Gallaudet president's acceptance speech had been signed and not spoken. Jordan concluded with a now famous quote, "Deaf people can do anything hearing people can do, except hear." In a meeting the Monday after the protest, as campus life resumed as usual, Dr. Jordan, Phil Bravin, and Greg Laibach discussed the historic moment they had just lived through. Laibach pointed out that it was the first time in Gallaudet history that the university president, the chair of the Board of Trustees, and the student body president had ever had a discussion without an interpreter present, since all 3 were deaf and fluent signers. One of the most successful student presidents in U.S. history, Deaf President Now achieved everything it set out to do. It achieved 3 of its 4 goals immediately, and within only 2 years, by 1991, they had achieved a 51% deaf majority Board of Trustees. The table in the meeting room for the Board of Trustees was replaced with a round table, both symbolic of equality among the board members and making it easier for deaf board members to see each other and the interpreters. Dr. Elizabeth Zinsser returned to her old job in Greensboro, North Carolina, where she continued her sign language classes and continued to advocate for deaf causes. Greg Laibach wrote Zinsser a letter wishing her well and noting that she was, quote, "an innocent victim and unfortunate target of our collective anger," end quote. Zinsser replied that she was not a victim because she had been chosen to, quote, "play a positive role in a significant historic moment," end quote. She wired Dr. Jordan and Phil Bravin her congratulations. In 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. DPN pushed for the passage of the ADA because it showed nationally that disabled people had rights. That being said, the presence of DPN as a part of the wider disability rights movement is something that occurred after the protest was over. At the time, it was about deaf autonomy. Deaf President Now brought deaf issues to national attention. It framed deaf rights as civil rights, and it set a precedent of deaf presidents at Gallaudet that is maintained to this day. Garnering unprecedented support from the hearing community at large, Deaf President Now remains one of the most successful student protests in American history. To wrap this up, I'd like to point out that as a hearing person, discussing an event so intrinsic to deaf culture, there are aspects of this history that I can't speak to. I recommend checking out some deaf perspectives on DPN because I promise you, you're not getting the full story if you're only getting it from a hearing person. A good place to start would be this book that I used as a reference, Controlling Our Destiny by Philip W. Bravin, the man who chaired the Presidential Search Committee and became the board chair in the wake of DPN, is an excellent insider perspective on what it was like being deaf and at Gallaudet during Deaf President Now. I highly recommend reading this if you want to learn more. I've also linked some videos by deaf content creators in the description box below, and I recommend that you watch some of those because, again, while I'm glad this video may introduce the events of DPN to some hearing people, you really should learn about it from the deaf community. Thank you so much for watching. If you learned something new, if you enjoyed this video, or if you just want to be nice, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and tell me something you learned or something you liked in the comments. If you didn't enjoy this video, give it a thumbs down and tell me how I can improve in the comment section below. If you're interested in more nerdy history content, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos, which I post on some Fridays. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. So don't doom yourself. I'll see you next time. Bye.